here tonight. And I know just talking about meeting together, it's interesting to me back a few months when this whole thing started, somebody had mentioned, and I thought it was a very good point, that the definition of a church is a called out assembly. And I think that is a great point, even with our politicians, that when you do church, you're assembling. And it's good to hear you all talk about the importance of that. Well, anyway, tonight we're going to continue our series, and I just want to continue to deal with this series of strongholds. And we're going to go to 2 Corinthians chapter number 10. If you want to join us in going there, we were in Ephesians 4 2 nights ago, and then the rest of the series here will continue to lay out a certain progression. Now, I'm going to get a little bit ahead of myself to lay out the progression so you have a little bit idea where we're going. As I mentioned last night, about 2.5 years ago, almost 3 years, I was in the province of Nova Scotia, and a pastor had talked to me about some of the needs in his congregation, about viewing some of the men struggling with viewing pornography, and it set me on a journey after watching a video series that he put in front of me. And in that video series, there was a book recommended, and I read the book Pure Desire by Dr. Ted Roberts, and in it he lays out addictive behavior in 4 categories. First, you have the addictive root. That's what we dealt with the other day. I use the analogy of real estate or land. That's where Satan builds the stronghold, and we dealt with stronghold could be a variety of things. That was certainly one application. The viewing issue is one application. There are many others that we talked about a couple nights ago, but the addictive root is basically your ground. Tonight we're going to go to the next one. That's the addictive mindset. That's what I'm going to call building materials when it comes to strongholds. Tomorrow will be the addictive behavior, which is the stronghold itself. We'll see that right here in the passage. And then the addictive cloak, that's the deception. Anytime we have besetting sin or issues in our life we're not dealing with, there's always, we package it in a way that throws people off. And it could always say this in a certain sense, we deceive others, but in deceiving them, we deceive ourselves. And so I'll just lay out those 4 steps. But as I mentioned, if there was there in the province of British Columbia, a foreign power had come in, as we talked about a couple nights ago, and was building a military installation, they would have to have real estate. They'd have to have secrecy. They'd have to have deception. They'd have to have building materials, and they'd have to have a plan. They'd have to be something that they're building that would be aggressive, that would be offensive, that they could use to launch attacks. Thus it is with our great enemy, Satan. He's got to get real estate, and he gets it from our own hearts. And as I mentioned the other night, we have legal right to the real estate, but if we give it to Satan, then he builds on it. And we mentioned a couple nights ago, just in review, that we give ground to Satan. One of the ways we give ground to Satan, and there are several, but this is the one I see today so prevalent, is when we let the sun go down upon our wrath. When we allow anger or frustration or resentment or bitterness not to be dealt with, then Satan gets real estate in our minds. It's really, again, I'm not talking about something like demon possession. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm simply talking about our thinking processes become unbiblical. And it is from that ground, if we can call it that, Satan begins to build strongholds in our lives. I'm going to read the text of Scripture, and then we'll kind of try to put it all together. In verse number 4 of chapter number 10 of 2 Corinthians, a familiar passage, it says, "For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty through God," and here's our word, "to the pulling down of strongholds." Again, a stronghold's military installation. Medieval times, as we talked about, you think of the castle, but that's the stronghold. It's our enemy, obviously, is there, and he's launching attacks from that stronghold. Then verse 5 says, "Casting down imaginations and every high thing that exalteth itself against the knowledge of God." Now, there's 2 aspects to a stronghold: imaginations and high things that exalt themselves against the knowledge of God. Now, we're going to deal tonight with imaginations. Tomorrow night, we'll deal with high things that exalt themselves against the knowledge of God. We're trying to make this extremely practical. Now, imaginations comes from a Greek word, logikos. Now, if you're familiar at all with the English language, you would recognize logikos is a word in the Greek that we get an English word from, and it's the word logical. And so really the idea of an imagination is a thought process. I like what one commentator has called imaginations illogical logic, because it's faulty reasoning. It's not thinking biblically. Obviously, an imagination's bad. You got to cast it down. So it's faulty reasoning. It's a thinking through process that is incorrect. So tonight, I want us to understand that building materials are unbiblical thought processes. Now, they usually come because we have given ground to Satan, and from that ground, we begin to hand him building materials. Could we say this? We begin to hand him bricks, and from those bricks, he begins to build a stronghold in our life. And I want to just, I'm going to just mention several things here tonight to get you thinking, because many times we get so used to wrong thinking patterns that we don't even realize they're wrong. And that's what happens in life. Yeah, that's why you need preaching. You know what preaching is? It's confronting wrong thinking. But I put it this way: wrong thinking always produces wrong action. Right thinking or biblical thinking always produce biblical actions. So our thinking is very important. As a man, as he thinketh in his heart, so is he. Proverbs 23:7. So we all recognize the importance of thought. But illogical logic, you say that's kind of funny, is it? Well, illogical logic, I guess in our country, we'd say that's how Democrats think. Illogical logic. Okay, I hope you're not offended by my political humor, but illogical logic. You probably have some politicians in your country who are like that. Illogical logic. They think it's logical, but it's not. But that's the way Satan is. He lays things out. He tempts us what seems to be really good logic and reasoning, but it's faulty. It's unbiblical. It's not right. And it's human thinking. And many times we think humanly because that's what we are. It's the way we kind of are. And it's just intrinsic to human thinking, which is unbiblical many times. The Bible confronts that. So many times when we allow there to be resentment and bitterness and anger towards someone in our hearts, or more than one people, that sometimes becomes a pattern in our hearts. There are ways Satan tempts us to think incorrectly. I'm just going to mention a few of them. One of the big ones is this: insecurity. Insecurity. Many times, young people who came from dysfunctional homes struggle with insecurity. Now, I'm going to read you a definition of insecurity. It's not mine, but it was in a book on insecurity that my wife was reading. And I thought, wow, that gets you to think. So here's the definition, a little involved, but you think about it. Insecurity refers to a profound sense of self-doubt. In other words, this person who doubt themselves on a regular basis. It's a deep feeling of uncertainty about our basic worth and our place in the world. Insecurity is associated with chronic self-consciousness, along with a chronic lack of confidence in ourselves and anxiety about our relationships. The insecure man or woman lives in constant, notice this word, fear of rejection and a deep uncertainty about whether his or her own feelings and desires are legitimate. Interesting definition. I can't totally relate with all of it, but I think all of us can relate with some of it. I want you to notice that little word, fear, constant fear. I think the thing about insecurity is fear. It's fear of failure. It's fear of what people think about us. It's fear of our place in life. It's fear of just a variety of things. It's interesting, if you do a study of Jesus' teaching, you will find the number one command that Jesus gives us in the negative form, like don't do this. The number one command, I think we all know what it is. It's fear not. Be not afraid. That's the number one negative command that Jesus gave. So he must have had a reason, because he knows our frame. He knows that we're dust. So one of our great propensities we have is toward fear, insecurity, self-doubt. Can I do this? Again, what it says here, a constant fear of rejection. And people do that. They fear being rejected because they've been rejected many times in those growing up years where formative things occur. And we talked about some of the parenting models last night that are not helpful in that regard. But now, let me just simply say, if I can say this, insecurity is not normal. Now, can I say this? It's prevalent. But if a person is raised in a home where there's a biblical understanding of child rearing, generally the kids are not going to struggle with a lot of insecurity. We all struggle with some, but it won't be a big issue in their life. So if it is a big issue in your life, it probably indicates that if you've given into it at all, that you've been given Satan building materials, and he'll take that insecurity and he will build a fortress or a stronghold from which he will defeat you. And you'll see tomorrow when we talk about some of those strongholds we alluded to a couple of nights ago. They sometimes don't seem unrelated, but they are related. So just to kind of give you an idea of, just since I'm going to take a little more time with insecurity than some of the other wrong thinking processes, Insecure person doubts God can use them. They often have an inordinate desire to make peace. They sometimes to an extreme. They harbor unrealistic expectations about relationship. These are not all original with me. I'm reading here from some of my notes. A chronic need for affirmation. They need people to approve of them. They live in terror of loss, loss of relationship, loss of people that they love them, care about them. They often promote themselves. They can even go to lying to make themselves look better than they actually are. In some cases, again, not all these things are characteristics of insecurity, but some of them are different people have different manifestations of it, is a better way to put it. Some it's even acting like the opposite gender. Some insecure women, insecure about their femininity, will act more like a man, and vice versa. Well, that seems to be very what is today, very up to date in today's society. Sometimes a woman will capitalize on sensuality. She's insecure about herself. She capitalizes on being sensual, so she will get attention from men. We all know that many insecure women are involved in the wickedness of our world in so many ways. They many times I understand that young girls who've been taken advantage of get insecure about many things and find themselves in that very industry that is tragic. So we know these things happen. So uh, another one is perfectionism that comes out of insecurity and trying to mask your insecurity with just being perfectionistic and into a to a way that's not helpful. We all know that's good to be excellent. Don't get me wrong. Excellence is a wonderful thing. The way you know you're into perfectionism in a negative way is when your perfectionism hurts people. And that's when we know we've stepped over the line from excellence. But so these are uh, different characteristics or manifestations of a person who gets into insecurity. And insecurity is I find a very prevalent issue today, though it really isn't normal. So if you're out here and really don't struggle with a lot of insecurity, you probably look back and realize that you grew up in a home where there was a lot of affirmation, there was a lot of encouragement, and you really didn't default to insecurity in a lot of ways. But many people today didn't have that privilege, and we all know that we live in a broken society, a broken world, and so that's one symptom. Another symptom I found to be very much uh, very prevalent when it comes to Satan building strongholds in people's lives, and that is the issue of worthlessness, a sense of worthlessness. Now, let me say about worthlessness, that's not normal either. Now, what I mean by that is, generally speaking, a young person coming from a balanced home is not going to struggle with worthlessness. They may struggle with discouragement here, and they may struggle with, okay, I blew it here, I failed here, but they don't struggle with worthlessness. They do sense I'm here for a reason. And but worthlessness is a big problem today. It may not be no, it may not be normal, but it's prevalent. It's everywhere. I remember my wife and I were counseling a single missionary, probably in the late 30s, and she was talking about an angry father that she had, and unfortunately he was the pastor, but an angry father she had, and we were kind of my wife and I were trying to help her. And I said to her, I said, hey, could somebody just sit down with your dad and try to help him through this, help him see this blind spot in his life? And a look of fear came over her face, and she said, oh no, if you did that, he would unleash on me and my mother. And I remember later in the conversation, I said to her, I said, do you ever struggle with worthlessness? I'll never forget her answer. Tears in her eyes. She looked back at me. She said, all the time. You might remember a couple of nights ago when I talked about that young man who came up to me after a session where I dealt with some of these issues. And he said, Brother Van Gelder, you described me tonight. My father's angry. My grandfather's angry. And toward the end of the conversation, I just thought I'd try it out on him. I said, well, you struggle with worthlessness? And he looked at me and just said, all the time. Almost anybody I've dealt with who are dealing with, fairly serious parent wounds, some of the things we talked about a couple of nights ago, you ask them whether or not they struggle with worthlessness, in almost every case they do. I was out with a dear older couple, probably in their 70s, retired from the pastorate, pastor and his wife. The wife was telling me her story of a very abusive home. You could clearly see the grace of God all over her. She had overcome many of these things. And I was really enamored by the victory in her life. And because I'd done study on this and done a lot of work and talked to a lot of people, I understood. And I understood some of the battles I'm sure she went through. And I asked her, I said, do you ever struggle with worthlessness? She kind of looked at me and smiled. And certainly, clearly, as she articulated, she had in her early years, particularly before she had really gotten a hold of how to get that healed and move past it. but that was definitely a part of her early life, that sense of worthlessness. And we know that's a lie. That's an absolute lie from Satan, because every single one of you listening to me, God created you to do something only you can do like God created you to do it. Nobody can do God's will like God made you to do it. And you are very worthwhile in God's view, because he made you to do something. And so worthlessness is not from God. But Satan comes along, and when we feel worthless, he tempts us to that. We hand Satan a brick, and he starts to build a stronghold in our life. You feel insecure. You doubt, can I make it in life? But we can make it in life, not in our own strength. But God, we can do all things through Christ. And he comes along and he tempts us to fear, that we're fear of failure, or fear that we won't, people reject us, whatever the fear might be. And we get crippled with fear. We know that's the opposite of faith. That's what happened to Peter when he was walking on the water. He got his eyes off the Lord, on the circumstances. He was filled with fear. Down he went till he looked back to the Lord Jesus with the eye of faith and the call of faith. The Lord saved me. The Lord delivered me. So that's another one. How about this one? Performance acceptance. Performance acceptance. This is another wrong thought process. If you're not sure what this is, read the book of Galatians a few times, and that's what the Apostle Paul was trying to deal with. They were calling it something else theologically. It was a false gospel. But performance acceptance is this, that I got to perform in order to be accepted. Now, where does that come from? Well, it comes from many homes that are dysfunctional, where a child feels like if I do these things, I'm loved and accepted, and if I don't, I won't be loved and I won't be accepted. Many times because you're yelled at, and they're dealt with in ways that are harsh and unloving. And so they get into this performance acceptance mode. I tell teenagers all the time, God doesn't want you to sin, but when you sin, God loves you as much when you're sinning as when you're not. His love for you doesn't change. Now, don't get me wrong, he's grieved about it, and he'll correct you because but he corrects you because he loves you. Proverbs 3 puts it so well, that God, whom the Lord loves, he chastens or corrects, even as a father, the son, here it is, in whom he delighteth. So I'm saying right now, you know why God corrects you? It's not because he hates you, it's because he loves you. And the reason he corrects you is because he's crazy about you, because he delights in you, because he knows what he's made you to do, and he wants to correct you so you can be effective in what he's called you to do. Wow, unbelievable. So performance acceptance is a lie from Satan. Tries to get us to think we got to do this to be accepted of God. Now, God accepts us in the sense that when we got saved, we're put into Jesus, and Jesus is in us. We're accepted in the beloved, and our acceptance is based on who we are in Christ. And he corrects us when we do wrong because he's got a job for us to do. He delights in us, and he wants to encourage us. And so we get the wrong think there. You don't have to earn God's love. That God so loved the world, he loves you with an everlasting love, Jeremiah 33 said. Remarkable verse. And so performance acceptance gets people in the wrong mode. And so many people are in that. And that really is a false gospel. It's legalism in the sense that you're trying to earn what you'll never be able to earn. You can't earn heaven. You can't earn sins forgiven. And you can't earn God's favor. And you can't earn acceptance from God. That comes by faith. It's a gift that he gets us because we trust him. And again, it doesn't diminish the fact that God corrects us, but he does it because he loves us. And that's a totally different feel. So much more could be said about that, because there's, again, the whole book of Galatians deals with that works-based sanctification, or if you do this, then, etc., you be sanctified. And the Bible tells us, no, you're sanctified by faith. In other words, we trust God. And as a result of our faith, we obey. Obedience is not diminished, but obedience is a result of faith. And so that's what happens. We trust God, and we say, okay, he's going to enable me to do this, so I'm going to step out and obey and trust him to enable me to do that. We'll talk about that later in the week. But performance acceptance, a wrong thought process. And when people get into that, they had Satan a brick, and they get into, I got to do this, and it's, again, many times out of duty, and it's out of restraint, and it's not out of joy, and it's not out of peace, it's not out of love for God. And so it comes out of the wrong motive, so it doesn't work. It's bondage, is what Galatians 5:1 puts it as. Okay, so that's there. Another one is people who many times come deal with this ground. Satan tempts them with a lack of trust. My dear friend that I mentioned last night, who at 5 years old, his dad walked out of his life. mother had to go to work, and so he had mother and father wounds. A dear friend, and I remember a few years ago he preached a message where he bore his soul and explained what it was like to come from such a dysfunctional home. And he said, once I got saved, he said, the greatest challenge I had in my Christian life, I thought this was very insightful. He said, the greatest challenge I had in my Christian life is trusting God. He said, the reason was, he said, I couldn't trust anybody. I couldn't trust my dad, couldn't trust my mom, couldn't trust anybody around me. He said, the only person I could trust was myself. Of course, he ended up letting himself down quite a few times. And he turned, by 12 years old, he was looking to marijuana and alcohol to medicate the pain. He gave 10 years of his life to crystal meth before he was wondrously saved at age 28. I'll probably tell the story a little later on in our series here. But the point is, from all that dysfunction, he said, I just learned to trust nobody. So when I got saved, after I got saved, he said, my biggest challenge was to trust God. Now, I think every believer can say one of our biggest challenges is to trust God, because I don't know about you, my flesh doesn't lend itself to automatically trust God. My flesh doesn't like to trust God. So I understand that. But I think it's a great challenge for him to learn to trust God. So that's another one of those things that comes, that wrong thinking that comes from giving Satan ground in our life. He hands us those I can't trust anybody bricks. Then another one that's going to sound a little strange, but it is really insightful and helped me. And I've done a lot of counseling now. In the last 2.5 years since I've gotten on this journey, I have counseled more people on a deep level than I counseled in the 34 or 5 years before of my ministry. It's been a unique thing. And one of the things I found is people that often come because there's an addiction in their life, they're Christians and they hate it. Most of the time, its issue is viewing pornography, but there's been other things that I've talked with people about that are what we call addictive behavior, besetting sins, things they can't kick. Anger would be another one, where a man is just struggles with anger in his home and his children and his wife, and all of that kind of thing. And it's a huge problem. I don't know. We'll talk about it as it goes on, but anger is a huge issue, and there is deliverance. We'll continue to talk about that as time goes on. But one of the things that is very interesting, that is one of those manifestations of wrong thinking, is what I'm going to call the eroticized wound. The eroticized wound. You say, what are you talking about? Well, this is a little uncomfortable. I'll try to be appropriate, but it has been stunning, and how I've noticed this, and I've asked different folks a question, and they've responded with things that have really been very stunning. But I was reading an article by Covenant Eyes, I think it is. Some of you are familiar with Covenant Eyes. Somebody had forwarded me an article, I read it. I saw another one I was interested in, clicked over there. And basically the article said something that I was stunned by. He said, you show me the kind, and again, this is out of my realm. But anyway, I understood what he was trying to go at. He said, you show me the kind of pornography that you are drawn to. He said, and I will tell you your wound. Well, I was stunned by that. Number one, because of my mother and her vigilance and her prayers, I believe God just largely kept me from what we might call pornography. Just like anybody in our culture, I've seen pornographic images on billboards, people walking around, etc. But thank the Lord, I've been largely spared from what we would call pornography. So I'm assuming, I guess when I heard that, I began to be aware that there are obviously different kinds of provocative material. That makes sense. I get that. But I began to ask people about that we'd come and talk about some of these things, and they would tell me the connections, and I was stunned by it. In other words, many times when there's an unhealed wound in your heart and life, Satan comes in and sensualizes that. Let me give you an example. Here's a guy, and he has no relationship with his dad, and he's craving a male relationship. I think all of us are seeing where that can go. Not in every case, but in some cases that can get sensualized, eroticized, and that person becomes vulnerable, particularly if they're taken advantage of in the realm of homosexuality. So we began to recognize that there's unresolved wounds. Satan is like a shark when he smells blood in the water. It's like blood in the water, man. He's on the deal. He smells that wound, and he will do what he can. And one of the things he can do, not in every case, but in many cases, I have found that there is a sensualizing of the wound. Now, this is the thing that I'll be encouraging is this. You see that wound healed, and you will find the temptation in that area diminished. And it is a remarkable thing. Some men, and I'm assuming women as well, found, I'm hooked. I can't get out of this. But when the wound begins to be healed, they find the pull of it begins to diminish, because the wound, Satan was using that wound, the need in that wound, to fuel, sensualize that wound. And they were trying to meet it the wrong way. They call it, my wife's done some research on this as well, and that's what a woman many times finds with what they call love addictions. And addictive behavior, always looking for love in relationships, never finding it. Of course, it's tragic, and we understand the world in which we live. There's a lot of that going on. So these are wrong thinking patterns that people fall into. Now, again, as God's people, you may say, well, then this isn't my issue, and it may not be, but it would certainly help you in counseling others. And for many of you, you say, okay, that makes sense. I struggle with this and this wrong thinking. And Satan takes that and he's going to build a stronghold. And tomorrow we're going to talk about the ways that stronghold, how you get defeated. Now, this begins to show you how, because a person who's hooked and looking at certain provocative material may not see the connection between the fact that they have an unhealed wound that Satan has gotten a hold of. And again, locked in with their selfishness and wrong decisions. That's a part of it. We'll deal with that later too. Man, that thing becomes a stronghold in their life. So the Bible's talking about imagination. The thinking is critical. In fact, really what we dealt with last night is part of the wrong thinking. Because when we don't deal with offenses and hurt and wounds and anger that comes from those things, when we don't deal with it, we're vulnerable. And Satan takes that thing and he begins to lie to us. And, the young man who's told by his dad, you can't do anything right. Satan will replay that in his mind who knows how many times. And every time Satan replays it, it's like giving Satan a break. And he builds something in your life when you don't think biblically. And I want to be compassionate about it, because all of us have done it, and all of us understand the dynamic. But it is a very real deal. Imaginations, faulty reasonings, wrong thought processes. Some other ones that would come, wrong thought. It's a lack of fulfillment in life. I want to ask you a question. Let me just give you the story. I was counseling a mother. My wife and I were counseling a mother and the daughter. The daughter had gotten into moral impurity and had a child out of wedlock, and very needy situation. The mother was there. The daughter was there. My wife and I were there. And I asked them the question. I said, would you characterize your life as being fulfilled? Would you say that character, where you're going to have moments where you're not fulfilled, but would you say largely is your life fulfilled and you're at rest? Or would consider your life to be not at rest and not fulfilled? And without any hesitation, they both said, oh, no, we have no rest. Well, that's not the way God wants the Christian life to be. We all know we're not perfect, and there's going to be moments of lack of peace, and there's going to be moments we don't have rest and we're not fulfilled. But if that's what characterizes your life, lack of fulfillment, and if we don't turn to Jesus to fulfill us, Satan lies to us. And that's what's going to feed what we're going to talk about tomorrow night, to try to be fulfilled some other way. And for some of you, it simply may be technology, wasting an inordinate amount of time on technology that God has other things he wants you to do. But you're hooked, you're locked in. And that's what happens with that, because you're not fulfilled in life. Several years ago, somebody came to me and said, hey, have you ever seen that Tom Brady video where he says there's got to be more to life, something like that? I can't remember. There's got to be something more. I said, no, I never have. They said, well, type in Tom Brady in YouTube and there's got to be something more, and watch it. I did. And some of you probably will when you're done here. Hopefully you don't do it during. But anyway, you'll see it. The interviewer just asked Tom Brady, how does it feel? You at that point, he'd won 3 Super Bowls. You've done this, whatever. I can't remember all he says. And Brady, as I remember, looks down. And he says, there's got to be something more. And the guy looks at him and says, what do you think it is? And he looks at him with consternation in his face. And he says, I wish I knew. Now, we all know what Tom Brady's missing is Jesus Christ. And we all know that's why he's not fulfilled in life. And I don't care how many Super Bowls he wins. I don't care if he wins one with the Buccaneers, which at this point doesn't look very likely. But he's not going to be fulfilled in life. But, a lot of Christians aren't fulfilled either. And they're looking to something else to fulfill. That is an indication of wrong thought process. In other words, what I'm saying is, if any of these things kind of strike you as, I think that way too much, You probably don't even realize it, but you have allowed Satan to build a stronghold in your life. Tomorrow night, hopefully you'll see it. Say, yeah, that behavior is not helping me in my Christian life. That's a besetting sin. Or it could be maybe something that in of itself isn't wrong, but it's a weight. The other part of Hebrews 12 is it's a weight, just something that you'd be better off without. And something in and of itself is not wrong, but you've allowed it to dominate your life in a way that's not helpful. So all of that comes down, and I talked about this last night, but I want to develop it a little further here tonight, and then we'll conclude. And that's the idea. You say, well, preacher, where am I on the deal? Okay, we talked about unhealed hurts. And I remember when I was watching that video series that was dealing with viewing pornography by that pastor in Nova Scotia, I was struck with something the instructor said. The instructor said, take the 10 most hurtful things that have ever happened in your life and write them down. Well, I remember my first thought was, because I came from a very good home. My dad was a pastor, my mom, pastor's wife, and my mom had deep insecurity because she came from a home where her parents died, and that sometimes insecurity just comes from circumstances in life. Like mother died when she was 9, father died when she was 14, so very traumatic, and threw her into dealing with a lot of insecurity. But thank the Lord, she really overcame that. Was a wonderful parent. But the point is, I grew up in a home where there weren't really a lot of parent wounds. I've had other wounds in life, and if you're growing up and never had parent wounds, thank the Lord, because most people have, and most of you listening probably have. But I will tell you this: if you grow up without parent wounds, you're going to get wounded. I can promise you that. But that's life. But I remember thinking to myself, especially in my younger years, I don't remember a lot of hurt. Then all of a sudden, a couple things came rushing back. When I was 6 years old, there were 2 severely autistic girls lived across the street in Chicago, where my dad pastored, and they falsely accused me. They had a little teeter-totter thing that swung around like this. I don't know, it wasn't a teeter-totter, but it swung, and they had motor skill problems, and they couldn't get out of the way, and they had bruised themselves. That thing had hit them on their thighs, put a deep bruise, and the mother was giving them a bath and noticed them. They asked the girls, how did that happen to you? And they mentioned my name. Well, I mean, I remember 6 years old. I remember thinking to myself, I'm going to jail. I'm done. My life is over. It was a very traumatic thing. My parents and I dressed up in our Sunday best. I remember I had a suit and coat tie. I only had one suit, coat, tie. Back days weren't a lot of money like there has come to be. Walked across that street, sat in those people's homes. I was falsely accused as a 6-year-old, first grader. And I remember thinking about that. I thought, I haven't thought about that in decades. And when I thought about it, I'm going to be dead honest with you. It hurt like it happened yesterday. I thought, that is really strange. That hadn't been there for 30 years. And it honestly hurt like it. And I realized, you know what? I have never processed that. And I've never allowed a God to heal that wound. In other words, as a 6-year-old, I had no way to process that biblically, scripturally, no way. But you know what? Now I do. So in a certain sense, I was able to go back and counsel that little 6-year-old if I can. And, talk about the fact, one, you say, what good things came out of that? That's one of the things that really helped me. I began to think, what good things have came out of that? I'll tell you, one of them is I've never been tempted to break the law, not at all, at least not, never at all, because that put a fear of God in me. And I'll never forget it. About 3 days later, they confessed that they had lied, and that mother felt really bad about it. For the rest of the time we lived there, where they were bringing peace offerings across the street, trying to appease what they had done. And I did forgive them, I think. But as a little 6-year-old boy, that was very hurtful. I am sure that's small compared to what some of you are going through, but I give it as an illustration. It helped me realize, you know what? I've never dealt with that. I've got a dear friend of mine who had deep father wounds, an angry father, deep father wounds. His wife put up a picture of his father, and she went to him and said, take that picture down. Could not even have a picture of his father at home. Because every time he saw that picture, everything came back. Some of you can relate with it. Everything came back. Long story. And I don't have time to go through it, because as we go through the process this week, we'll deal with some of this. He really did get healing in that area. And he really did deal with the bitterness toward his dad. And he dealt with the wound, and he dealt with things. And we're going to talk about last night, giving ground to Satan. We're going to talk about getting it back. And I'm going to give you a clue. The gateway to getting it back is forgiveness. That's the gateway to getting it back. I'm going to give you a little true heads up so you know where we're going. But he forgave his dad, dealt with things, and then went back, spent some time with his dad, whatever. And now he's got a picture of his dad in his home. He can go by it. He said, when I go by that, he said, there's no more hurt, and there's no more rise in his heart. See, could we say that wound's been healed? There's a scar there. There always are scars, but the wound's been healed. And thank God that Jesus has come to heal the brokenhearted. He comes to heal. He is here to heal. But my point is, if you have unhealed hurts, if you think about some of the things we've talked about, and it hurts like it happened yesterday, it does indicate that you're vulnerable, that the blood's in the water, and Satan's circling. If he hadn't already got you in some area, he's gonna come after you. And that's why I bring up the unhealed hurts. And so I thought of that as a 6-year-old, and then all of a sudden I was on the sidelines as a 14-year-old soccer player standing next to my coach, and there was a close game. I think it was 0-0 or 1. We were losing 1-0, I think, at a rival school in Indiana. I was in Illinois, and make a long story short, I blew a play. I should have scored a goal, didn't. And the coach just lost a cork. I mean, he lost it, and he pulled me out of that game. And he said some things. And when I thought of that, I hadn't thought of that in a couple decades as well. When I thought of that, it hurt like it happened. And I realized, you know what? I never processed that. As a 14-year-old boy, I had never processed that. And I really had to go back in both those cases and process it. Realize God can heal that. Those are small matters. They weren't continual. They're small compared to what some of you perhaps have faced. But they illustrated me the truth of an unhealed hurt. And it's so simple because it hurts just like it happened. That's how you know it's not healed. Like my dear friend now can walk by and see a picture of his father, spend time with his father, and there's a healing there. It's not fresh with him. There's no hurt, and there's no rise in his heart, no bitterness, resentment. That's all gone now. So I know we're on a journey, and I feel like every time I'm unpacking it, you're probably thinking, where are we going to get some help? And I want to encourage you, help's coming. I try to throw in enough along as we go along to give you hope. But I feel like we're in a broken society, and I have been very burdened that God's people realize that Jesus can completely heal you. You know what happens? You get healed, you'll smell it with other people, and you'll know how to help. And that's what God can do. And he can really use you. In fact, the amazing thing is now, I guess, of course, this whole journey started recognizing, we'll talk about some of these statistics tomorrow, but recognize the issue of viewing the inappropriate material. I have now seen guys who were hooked on addictive behavior, looking at pornography, who are not only seeing sustained victory, but are now turning around and helping multiple others get the victory that God's given them. That's where we're going for everybody out here. And again, maybe you're not struggling with anything that's besetting sin that's getting you. Maybe yours is anger or something else. But even if you're not, you can help others with it. And if you are, you keep listening, because we're going to continue to deal with this stronghold. So let's just get in review. In order to have a stronghold, you got to have real estate. That's the addictive root. You got to have building materials. That's the addictive mindset. Tomorrow, we're going to deal with the addictive behavior. That's the stronghold itself. That's the high things that exalt themselves against the knowledge of God. We're going to deal with that tomorrow. So we kind of see where we're going using the scripture here. So I want you to be encouraged that the Bible tells us here, casting down imaginations, which means that there's weapons that God has given us that are not carnal. They're not fleshly. They're not in our human, the way we were born. We got them when we were born again. They're spiritual. And God has given us weapons to take these strongholds, these foreign military installations out of the soil of our own heart that Satan has reared up. And we can take them back, and we can cast them down, and then turn around and help others. So that's where we are in our progression. And I hope you'll be encouraged and in the Lord. And I'll turn it over to your pastor at this time.